Hi everybody, welcome to pre-record 1. So you've just met me in the live session, and just a reminder to have a pen and paper with you to make notes about anything that you want to ask or found interesting or want to reflect back to the group on while you're watching the slides. So I have one video embedded in this slide, but for the rest of the slides it's just the PowerPoint and me talking, and yeah, there'll be instructions at the end as to what to do next. And I hope you enjoy, and I look forward to hearing what you've got to say about it later on. So we can't really talk about contextual safeguarding without making reference to Dr. Carleen Firmin and her team. This research was originated by Carleen Firmin when she was at the University of Bedfordshire. It was a PhD study. She's written an amazing textbook on her work from its origins up till now. And she was looking at what was happening to children and young people who were being sexually and criminally exploited, and saw, some fundamental flaws in what was happening in the way that children's services were set up, and how it wasn't really set up to manage these kinds of types of abuse with adolescents. So from that came the idea of contextual safeguarding. So she's developed it as both a theory and an operational framework, which is brilliant because it means that the university works very closely with practitioners, and that information goes back and forth in between people who are working on the ground and the university. And the whole aim of it is to draw attention to and address what's happening in the social and cultural contexts of each of these children's lives. So how they are being abused outside of their family home, but what happens in the bigger picture around that, and what's the kind of ecosystem in which they live in, and how do we respond individually and specifically to each child's context. So yeah, a really interesting idea, but also a very practical based set of theories and understanding about how we can best support children in these specific contexts. So key points for this course. As you might have guessed, it's an approach. So the way that it's delivered in each different area will be different, because your context will be different, the way that your organisation is set up will be different, the issues that you're facing are different. So it's not a model. There are ideas that will be played out across different local authorities, but they will look different in their, in their development and how they are then progressed in each local authority. So because it's been very practitioner and research led, that has come very much from kind of grassroots areas. So how, for instance, it's delivered in Hackney will be different to how it's delivered in Bristol. And that's one of the real strengths of this approach, is that, like the way we work with young people, it's a very individual approach, because one person will feel different to another person in the same way one local authority will work differently to another local authority. So each of these areas will have it uniquely applied to the way that they operate. So how you have it in Thurrock will depend on, who you've got leading contextual safeguarding, how, it's championed within your area, what history you've got of doing this kind of work, what services you've got, whether you've got youth service or you don't. So, it will look very different for you than it will potentially to other authorities. Or maybe it look quite similar because, you have a lot of examples in London which you can look to for guidance. So there have been test sites across the UK, and people are continuing to test out these ideas. And I will talk a lot more about that as we progress through the course. To explain the bigger picture for you, the University of Bedfordshire was initially given a few years funding to trial contextual safeguarding ideas. And with that, they had 10 test sites across the country, a few of those in London, where the university worked closely with these local authorities, and those practitioners with the researchers, came up with ideas about how they could implement the kind of origins of the work, and the university helped formulate that. And then these ideas got trialled and formed part of the contextual safeguarding framework. However, that funding has now finished, and so what has now taken place is that Carleen has moved universities and her team have moved to Durham, and so from Durham now there are both local area interest networks and local champions still happening, even though the initial research has finished. So these groups meet during the year. If you're interested in being a local champion for contextual safeguarding, this is something where you would need to be nominated by your strategic lead, and they would then, with the university, get in touch and see if you could be set up to be a champion. Or if you have an interest in this in Thurrock, then there is a form to fill in on the university website where you express your interest and why you'd like to be part of the network, and Carleen or her team would get back to you and see if you could be part of the groups. So there's a lot of work happening in and around the country that's being pulled together by the university. This is then used to inform and support the changes that are made strategically to guidance, inform the government of what we're learning from here, and all this is kind of fed back in and then fed back out again to people like yourselves, who will then hopefully be doing the work on the ground. So you can sign up to a newsletter from the University of Durham, which will keep you informed of any future changes. Here is a video from the Contextual Safeguarding Network. So if you just hover your arrow over the screen, you should be able to play it through your own computer. And then, yeah, there's some more slides following this. But if you just want to press play and have a listen to the university talk about contextual safeguarding, it's 3 minutes long, and then continue with the slideshow.
Contextual safeguarding is an approach to safeguarding children and young people that recognizes and responds to their experiences of significant harm beyond the boundaries of their home. Contextual safeguarding approaches require practitioners to identify and respond to risks and vulnerabilities facing young people in a range of social environments. In other words, a contextual approach to safeguarding identifies and responds to more than individual risk factors and vulnerabilities. Child protection and safeguarding structures already routinely identify and respond to violence and abuse experienced by young people within their family or home settings. However, these structures are yet to consistently engage with other social environments where young people spend their time. As young people enter adolescence, they spend increasing amounts of time outside of the home and may experience violence and abuse within these public environments. We know that a young person's peer group can be more influential than their family when it comes to setting standards of what is normal, and we know that peer-on-peer abuse can affect any young person. While schools can be a protective factor for many young people, research has also documented young people's experience of sexual harassment and other forms of peer-on-peer abuse in educational settings. Schools have also been sites of peer recruitment into abusive and sometimes organized networks of exploitation. We know that young people experience violence and abuse in public spaces. Exposure to violence on the streets has been routinely linked to a young person's involvement in street gangs, and young people have been sexually exploited in parks, transport hubs, shopping centers, and other public spaces. Contextual safeguarding calls for a safeguarding system that assesses risk and intervenes to protect young people beyond the boundaries of their home. For more information and resources, please visit the website of the Contextual Safeguarding Network.
So here we have a slide that's come from the Contextual Safeguarding Network, and this slide helps us think about all of the different types of extrafamilial harm. So the different types of harm that occur outside of the family home. And I'm going to invite you to think about in the live session which ones of these that you work with and to come up with examples of how this relates to your daily practice. So sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, we've learnt, a fair bit about these areas, less so with criminal exploitation, but we're recognising that these are types of abuse that happen very much in public spaces, including technology within that. So children are groomed and met outside of the home, and then they are coerced and manipulated into then taking part in sexual or criminal acts. So both of these have quite a strong parallel with one another, and there's quite a strong crossover between those as well. We also know that young people experience serious youth violence in their communities. It's not uncommon anymore to hear about children being shot and stabbed in the street. So this, will also potentially link with the criminal and the sexual exploitation as well. Many of those young children and young people may have already experienced bullying in their lives. They may be social isolated from their peer group. Maybe they've been coerced into radicalisation, again, a similar grooming process to CSE and CCE. And maybe those young people also experience relationship-based abuse. So for many young people, they will be a poly-victim of more than one of these types of harm. But this is the type of harm that contextual safeguarding is concerned with. Here we have an infographic which is taken from Furman, Rowe and Lloyd's research in 2019. And it helps us look at the common themes around the extrafamilial harm that we've just been talking about. So we'll work from the middle out. So when we think about those types of harm, you'll notice that there are similar definitions, characteristics, methods and situations in which the young people are exploited. So there are issues of power and dominance, of constrained consent, and we're going to look at a model of consent in a moment, and then the concept of exchange. So when we think about the power and consent, we can think about how, peers may influence each other or be coerced into recruiting other young people into exploitation. There's a grooming process. Many of those young people don't have choices, so all of the choices that they have might be abusive or difficult choices, in which case they're not really consenting. Maybe they're living in poverty, and the immediate material gains or emotional gains, if maybe there's emotional neglect, for instance, in that young person's life, what they might then gain from these types of exploitation and situations are that their immediate needs are met, but then what they might find is that they're then pulled into debt bondage. So there are crossovers within these different areas. And then, when we think about the concept of exchange, we think about how that then creates difficulties and barriers for maybe professionals to see that they're not active consenting choices that young people are making, that they are done within the context of the social and economical structures that they live in. When we think about how many young children are living in poverty, they're living with inequality on a daily basis, and then we can sort of think about the wider structures that we live in, which are influenced by the capitalist ideas, by consumerism, and then within that you've also got structural racism, the gender norms that we all live by. So all of these things are part of how we understand young people's choices and the limited choices that they may have, or the constrained, compromised choices that they have to make within the context of their lives. So it's a really useful piece of research if you want to go and have a look at it. And it helps us think about the next slide that we're going to go to when we're thinking about what Jenny Pierce calls abused consent. So she helps us look at how we can think about this in 4 different areas. That the first one is around professional negligence, and she calls this abusive condoned consent, which is where when we don't see that the young person isn't really consenting because of what we've just talked about in the previous slide, then that means that we behave in a way and where our safeguarding actions are in a way condoning what's happening to them, because we put the responsibility for the abuse on their shoulders. Then we can think about coerced consent, which is the grooming process, the violence that children and young people experience or are threatened with if they don't do, what's required of them, how emotional control can be taken of those young people, and how the immediate personal gain that they get from the relationships that they are groomed into are what pulls them into sometimes that situation in the first place without realizing what's happening. So there's a financial need, there's a lot of survival issues for many of the young people, that personal gain is literally about surviving from day to day. And so that financial need, we can call that survival consent, because maybe that young person does that sex act or deals those drugs because that's the only way they're going to get themselves fed that day. Or maybe they're sofa surfing in somebody's house, and they know that if they stay there that they will end up being abused that night, but the only other option is to be homeless or on the street. So neither of those are choices. You're not really consenting in those situations, because to consent truly you have to have choices, and you have to have freedom and capacity with those choices. So if they're all abusive choices, they're not really choices. And then finally, we have peer pressure, which is abusive normalized consent. And that's where if you have friends and your peers are in the same situation as you and maybe being abused in the same way as you, that can become normalized and minimized in a young person's world, and also in the way that we see it. So it's a really interesting model compared to the social model of consent, which is the one that we are more familiar with.
We are now at the end of this session. Thank you so much for listening. Hopefully you've made some notes. Maybe you've got some questions, maybe you've got some reflections. It's time for a break, and I will have told you what time we are coming back. So I look forward to hearing all your thoughts, and yeah, see you in the next live session. Thanks, everybody.